So thanks to everybody for coming along. You know, already polyrural is fading into the distant past. And we did a lot in it, actually, much more than was foreseen in the contract. So it's worthwhile going back and having a look at what we did. And some of the things that we worked on, they gave us valuable lessons that we want to bring forward into Polyrural Plus. So as I did the last time, this is just a reminder for anybody who's new to Polyrural or who's coming to the second webinar who didn't manage to come to the first one. I just put up here a summary as to what we were trying to do. And basically we used 12 regions carrying out a strategy process or a policy process. We use this as a kind of a platform with which to experiment and explore the use of various IT tools. And the main points that we evoked in, say, the first webinar, Lessons Learned Part 1, were based on the general, lessons that we learned about running policy processes and the challenges faced by local government nowadays. And so one of the things that we spoke about is how the world is changing very quickly. And I mentioned this the last time, I mention it again because I think it's so important. So I'm a little bit repetitive on it. But the point is that we have our business as usual and the things that we normally have to deal with in life. And then other stuff happens that's unplanned. And in recent work that I've been doing, looking at the change of global order and work for the Club of Rome, actually, there are all kinds of amazing and interesting things happening which are going to have an impact even at local government level through their impact on supply chains, global business opportunities. So anybody involved in import or export, which is essentially everybody in Europe, to some extent relies on imports from abroad. And you'll get the slide, so you can go back over this again. But one of the things that surprised me is that this year, more than 64 countries and the EU are going to the polls and having elections. And that corresponds to about 49% of the global population. So it's quite extraordinary. And it includes countries such as the Russian Federation and Indonesia, very big countries that have an important role to play globally. Also South Korea, the US, Belgium, the EU, etc., etc. So 64 countries altogether are going to the polls. And what's interesting about this, or noteworthy about this, is that in many of those countries, there's a lot of social unrest because of inequalities, because of the perception that citizens are not happy with their standard of living, which is going down across the world, actually. In every other country, the standard of living is falling, and people are not happy about it. So just to bear in mind, as those elections happen and accumulate, there'll be a reorganization of the global order, and who knows what that will mean for us in Europe. And it will filter down to what we do, even at local level, micro-local level, at the level of the local administrative unit. And so what we're being asked to do by people in politics at a high level, at national, European, and at the level of the global institutions, such as the United Nations, etc., is that we need to go beyond business as usual. We need to accelerate progress on existential challenges, such as fighting and avoiding the climate change, the potential for catastrophic biodiversity loss. And what people are saying is that we're no longer really talking about change, fiddling at the edges. We need transformation. And so this is the new normal, is that we're living in an age of disruption. We're looking for transformation, not change, and lots of unexpected things are going to happen. So within the context of EU policy, one of the things that had already happened and during the time of the Polyrural project was the 6th CAP reform, And then there was the Recovery and Resilience Plan. And this demands a lot more of people in national government and also regional government, all the way down to the local administrative units, not only in terms of inputs to policies that are being decided at different levels, but also in terms of finding the money and resources needed to implement the changes deemed necessary at local level. So this is a huge challenge, and I suggest that you reflect a little bit on this rather than just being overburdened and burned out and over busy and complaining about it. Note that this is a change that's happening to everybody right now in local government. They're in a kind of a crisis. They don't have the money to do everything they need to do. They don't have the staff in general, as a general rule. And the response so far has been to cry out for more money and for more staff. But listen, you know, this is the voice, the vox clamantis in deserto, as the Romans used to say. It's not that easy to get more money, and it's not that easy to get more staff. And what you can do in the meantime is find new ways of working that make you increase your capabilities and make you more productive. And that's exactly what this kind of a project is about. How can we be more productive and better and more performant, given the limited resources we have and the increasing burden of tasks that we're being asked to perform?
I'm sorry, Patrick, for interrupting you. Johanna is waiting in the waiting room, so would you please let her in again?
Okay, just a minute. For some reason, the alert didn't pop up, but she should be able to come in. In the future, by the way, I'm not going to stop in mid-webinar. If somebody's late, that's hard luck. They can catch up with the recording. So I ask everybody to be on time. So anyway, let's come back to somehow I lost control there. Yes. So this is just a reminder of, you know, one of the kind of revolutionary things that happened in the middle of the POLIRURAL project was the introduction of something called the long-term vision for rural areas. And this is the first time we've had a vision at EU level for the rural areas. We've had visions for regions in general and for cities in particular, but not for the rural areas. And we've gone over this before, but basically what it requires is that by 2040, in accordance with this long-term vision for rural areas, a lot of change is required in terms of local governments, its ability, the ability of local administration to integrate strategies, and also being able to orchestrate the mixture of policies that that are being developed, say, at national and EU level, but these have to be integrated and orchestrated at the local level. And one of the things that's requested or suggested in the LTVRA is looking at the interdependencies between rural and urban areas. And this is one of the themes of our project, the POLIRURAL Plus. And an extra layer that's added to this is to support the new European Bauhaus. Whatever that is, we haven't discussed it yet. And we'll have a look at that a little bit later on in a future webinar. But anyway, the LTVRA, again, is something that emerged in the course of POLIRURAL when we were doing the POLIRURAL project. And as a result, we had to pivot and we had to change our language and adapt the orientation of the different plans we were developing. And so in this webinar, we're going to focus on the IT tools and the use of artificial intelligence and the use of platforms of different kinds to support the work of local administration, basically to allow local administration to do more in shorter time with the limited resources that it has. And so ultimately we created three major tools. One was called CEMEX, the POE, is the Policy Options Explorer. And the idea here was that it's a tool that allows people in local administration, on the basis of a model, to explore policy options and use this exploration as a support for their decision making to decide which are the options we want to adopt and ultimately implement locally. And then we had a specialization of this called the Rural Attractiveness Explorer. And we'll come to that at the end. But the main work that we did was really around the Policy Options Explorer. Nevertheless, let's have a look at what we did in the Semantic Explorer, because there were many lessons to get out of this experience. And we did do some work that we could try to continue on in the course of POLIRURAL Plus. So the idea here is that there are many tools that have been developed by people working on their thesis in computer science or entrepreneurs in the IT area as well. They've developed many tools for exploring texts. So trying to find meaning in text, trying to understand the sentiment that's behind the text, trying to summarize text, etc. And so many of these tools are available on GitHub. And so our work, part of our work in POLIRURAL, was to take a bunch of these tools, download them, implement them, and play around with them to see how they could be useful for us and how they might serve people involved in local administration. So to give a focus to this, I picked out, I've been working in Foresight and providing consulting services to governments at different levels for about 25 years now. And over that period of time, I've started off a little bit random, feeling my way as to what is the best way to work and the best way to do things. And at this stage, I have a lot of processes that are, I guess, have matured. And so what I did was I tried to codify a little bit the way I work, especially when I'm working with government, local governments, or whoever my client is, and look at the processes and ask the question, how can we make those processes more effective and more efficient? So this is just a quick list of one of my inputs to the work that we were doing in the use of natural language processing, and a way to set up experiments, concrete experiments, and how we could use those tools and to understand what kind of efficiencies or productivity gains we could get. So, excuse me, every time I have to admit people, the screen jumps for me. Anyway, so the first thing that I tend to do, since I'm almost full-time in the whole business of policy and strategy development, I have what I call the anti-library. I subscribe to about 60 magazines and sources of information, and I screen them most days, and I flag up issues and articles and references and workshops that I think will somehow be important in the future. Not fully knowing exactly how they will be important, but just feeling that, this could be a weak signal. This is an area that could gain in significance in the future. And so I don't have the time to actually dive into these things, but I essentially collect all these articles and flags, and I put them into a folder. And you probably know a guy called Nicholas Nassim Taleb. He's quite a famous author on interesting things related to finance, trading, the psychology of markets, etc. But he calls this the anti-library. So it's a library that contains books you haven't read and hope to one day. So part of my task is monitoring all of these sources and just putting aside things that could be interesting. And it's a huge task. It takes up a big chunk of my day. And then when there's a theme that I need to dive into and understand, I would perform a first pass where I try to identify the documents which are relevant for my project. I carry out a second pass where I would do a detailed reading of a selection of those documents. And this is a lot of work. And then out of this, I produce some things that I've come to call curated reading lists. And these are short summaries on topical issues where I have a text that it could be 1 page, it could be 10 pages, but let's say it's a 1-page summary of some topic that's of current importance. And the key ideas are outlined. And then on the second page, I would have a set of references to credible, authoritative texts, and this, I call it the curated reading list. And so we can use short documents like that to support a discussion with a group of stakeholders, basically to bring everybody up to date, to make sure that they understand the issues. And for those that want to dive into it a little bit and understand more, they have a bunch of references. And of course, out of this, the part of the work as well, I produce what are called inventories. So they could be inventories of policy options. For example, if we're looking at the decarbonization of agriculture, there's a whole range of policy options that you could adopt to support the decarbonization of whatever sector of agriculture you're looking at. It could be horticulture, it could be dairy farming, it could be wine production. But the idea is that you scan what's happening around the world and you make a list of basically what other people are doing in other parts of the world. And usually quite quickly, if you can do this work, you end up with a lot of information that's new to most people, but anchored in reality, based on ideas that someone else has thought of, someone else has tried and has had some measure of success with. So the inventories are an important concept. And then on specific options, you might decide to do a deep dive where you go into much more detail and you say, okay, if this is an option that we want to explore seriously as a policy option, let's do a deep dive and come to a real understanding as to how, if we should implement it in our own region, and how we might go about doing that. Anyway, the whole point about it is that this is very labor-intensive work, and it's not a job for everybody. If you give the same text to 2 people and then ask them what they read, you'll get 2 very different answers. And that can be a positive thing, or it can be a negative thing. It's a negative thing in the sense that you give a bunch of text to some people and you ask them what's in it, and they have no idea at all. And that can happen, especially if people are not trained as researchers or if they're not used to that kind of work. It's not easy work to do. So this kind of work is the kind of work where you would hope to be able to use artificial intelligence and make some major productivity change. So what we tried, the way that we had set it up in POLIRURAL, was we said, let's develop some of these documents, and we can do it collectively, sharing out the work amongst the different regions. And we do it the old-fashioned way, spending time searching and using Google and reading documents and writing summaries, etc. And let's be conscious of the time and effort that goes into it and try to measure this so that we have an idea of, when we produce the document, how much labor is involved. And then let's also, with the tools we've developed, use those tools to shorten the labor and then make a comparison of any efficiencies gained. And you can make a comparison in 2 ways. You can look at the quality of the output and the quality of the content and judge whether it's relevant, whether the system captured the elements of content that are important or whether it didn't. And you can also look at the amount of time involved, how quickly you're able to do this. And you could even get into the profiles of the people, leading the work, because it's very expensive to hire professional researchers, and especially the good researchers, they're all very busy. So we need tools that ultimately are a kind of a research assistant that allow busy people who have different backgrounds to come up with a performance in this kind of work that's, maybe similar to the performance you'd get from a good human research assistant. Anyway, this was the general idea of what we wanted to do. To be honest, we did manage to do some experiments, but we didn't get as far as we wanted, basically because the range of tools that we were exploring was just far too vast. But we did do some experiments and we did get some feedback. And all of those experiments, they're gathered together through a single interface, and the different tools were evaluated, and all of this work is available on the POLIRURAL website. So for those of you who are curious, who want to torture themselves with detail, you can jump into this and have a look at what was done. And we set up trials of the different tools. People were asked to evaluate them, and these are the reports of the trials that were carried out by the different partners, regions in the project. Anyway, we're not going to dwell too much on that right now. We're going to put the focus on the other tools. And as I said, the idea of these tools using machine learning and natural language processing, AI tools for natural language processing. In other words, processing a text and trying to understand what's in it and simplify it in some way and present it to users. For example, process 100 or 1,000 documents and come up with a one-page summary on a specific topic of what's in those documents on a specific topic. This is the kind of work we wanted to do. So we produce some documents the old-fashioned way. And these include, and they're available on the website, and we'll make them more available in the POLIRURAL Plus website as well, as legacy documents that we can still use, that are still useful. And so there's a methodology document on the Foresight and developing the future outlooks using these different tools. There's an inventory of drivers of change. Those of you who are familiar with Foresight, they know all about the exploration of drivers of change, etc. If any of you are not familiar with it, I'll organize a webinar in a couple of weeks where we look at the whole Foresight methodology and the different approaches that you might like to adopt in your regional action plan. But then we had a bunch of deep dives. So we had deep dives on the impact of COVID. We had a deep dive on the CAP reform. And at the time, the regions were being consulted in principle on CAP reform. And we also had a deep dive on the Green Deal and the impact of the Green Deal for rural regions. And at the time, in the big meetings, the meetings on the Rural Pact, the meetings of the Committee of the Regions involving DG Agri, the message from, say, the president of the Committee of the Regions and the commissioner, the Director General for DG Agri, was that you need to develop a local Green Deal. You need to do this at a local level and do it now, because if you wait for central government, they're overwhelmed and they are relying on your inputs to be able to formulate the Green Deal at national level. So this was the message. I would say largely it fell on deaf ears, probably because people were just too overwhelmed with the pace of change and things that were happening, and they just didn't have the staff to allow them to respond to that. So I think it's probably unfair to say that it fell on deaf ears, but the response was far from what it should be, given the importance of the task. But one of the things that we saw from sharing out the work, like the inventory of drivers of change contains more than 60 curated reading lists. And we shared this work out among the 12 regions. And it was pretty interesting to see the variation in the feedback. And so it was clear that some of the teams were, very experienced at doing research and producing summary documents, and they produced very good work. And other teams just, they did a Google and they got the mouse and they scrolled down about, 1,000 lines on this endless page, and they clicked, Control C and then Control V and put it into a document and said, okay, that's the work now. This is the curated reading list. So it was quite an eye-opener to see the variation in skills and abilities, and also the response based simply on available time and personnel. So what it highlighted is the fact that in developing these tools, we're not trying to develop, be better than Albert Einstein. It's more like the Homer Simpson. If we can be better than Homer Simpson, we're probably doing something that's going to be useful to a lot of people. But anyway, one of the key lessons that came out was where we did manage to process large number of documents and come up with summaries, was that when you get this output, there's still a lot of editing and fiddling around with references and formatting to be done to produce a document that you can actually show to stakeholders or share with your colleagues. So one of the big lessons that came out was all of these little mindless tasks that you might give little importance to, basic editing tasks, that these take up a huge amount of time and effort. And in developing these tools, we also need to pay attention to those things if we're to end up with a tool that will provide us with a document in an efficient way. Otherwise, you'll just get a document and there's still weeks of work to be done to lay it out in a way that you can share it. Anyway, these were the main lessons from our experiments with the CEMEX. And as a legacy, we have a bunch of documents that I think most people said they found useful. But people are polite, too polite, I would say. They always say things are interesting and useful. And it's only 2 years later, in a different context, that they start to come out and say, listen, this was a waste of time, or this is not, we should have done something else instead. But we live in an age of change, and there's a certain urgency to making progress. So I hope people are, forthright and honest about the evaluation of the tools that we're developing, and also come in early with their own ideas as to what they think is needed to make their work more efficient, so that they can respond to their tasks and the urgent issues they have to deal with. Anyway, so much for the CEMEX. This is one of the things that we could try to do is in using the new tools, because what has happened in the meantime is that there's been a big breakthrough in the availability of pretty advanced and pretty capable tools, especially in the area of generative AI. And they seem to be fairly good at doing summaries, doing many of the tasks that we wanted to do in POLIRURAL, actually. But they're much more, like billions of dollars and euros has gone into the development of these tools. So we don't have to be embarrassed about the fact that they arrive with a level of performance that is way beyond anything we could ever have hoped to do in POLIRURAL. So we have understood the problem better in POLIRURAL, and now we're in a much better position to understand how we'd like to use the tools that are currently available, and that Runar and John and all those guys in our project are working on. So what ultimately we want to develop labor-saving methodologies and shareable resources on issues such as the next CAP reform, which will happen in the middle during the consultation for the next CAP reform will happen during the POLIRURAL Plus project. There's an evolving Green Deal. We still have to deal with the decarbonization of agriculture, rural energy communities. There's the new European Bauhaus. There are a lot of things, an increasing number of things that we need insight into. And having to read the 500 or 1,000 pages of papers that are available on EU websites is not a solution for us, because it's just not physically possible. So what I've done is I've tried to flag up some themes here that we could try to look into. And on the urban-rural nexus, there's local food systems, local energy systems, waste management, and the circular bioeconomy. These are all areas where there's a crying need for collaboration between people in urban administrations and people in rural administrations to actually coordinate and work together so that you get seamless solutions to both, on the one hand, the problems of people who are based in the city or urban areas, and the problems or the challenges of those who are based in rural areas. And again, there are all the unexpected shocks. And so I have a cartoon here, a recent cartoon from the Financial Times, which is meant to illustrate the difficulties being faced by the banks right now. And the new EU legal framework for banking, ESG, the need to get around greenwashing, and there are so many problems that exist in the financial sector. And these are problems that we're going to have to deal with at the level of local administration. But solutions actually exist. They're not mainstreamed, but lots of solutions exist. So even though the problem is there and is being generally felt, one of the things that I think we really need to make progress on in this project are the kind of solutions in innovative finance that regional administration can tap into. And then there's the shocks. You know, we had the shock of COVID, we had the shock of Brexit, we had the shock of, you know, the rumblings of the war in Ukraine. All of this was happening around about the time of the POLIRURAL project. So we had to deal with those shocks, although the extent to which we responded to them, I think, was fairly weak. The shocks were too sudden, and we just didn't have the tools or the processes in place to really deal with them. So if those of you, if you know Monty Python, if you're old enough to remember the Flying Circus, on the bottom right hand here, there's the cliche from the movie where nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. And of course, the joke is that not even the Spanish Inquisition expected the Spanish Inquisition. So that's a reference for the oldies who know about Monty Python. So in the Policy Options Explorer, we developed an explorer based on an approach to modeling complex systems called system dynamic modeling. Now, some of you might know a little bit about system dynamic modeling. You might know a little bit about modeling, but modeling is a huge area. And even people who are full-time professional modelers, it's limited what anybody can know about the vast range of modeling options that are available, and even the role and the way modeling is used in the modern world. So the starting point for us was this system dynamic modeling, which really came to the fore with the work of the Club of Rome in the 1970s. So they produced a very important report called Limits to Growth. I think it was 1972 when it was published. And that was the report is full of graphs and full of predictions based on the use of a system dynamic model of the global economy, including aspects of demography and society and labor, etc., and also embedding the availability of natural resources such as fertile soils and petroleum under the ground and etc., etc. So they tried to really develop a huge model with everything, every parameter that would have an impact on the evolution of society and the economies, the global economies. And basically they came up with and they did many, they had about 10,000 parameters. So for some of you, you might consider that a complex model, but it was basically the limit of what was possible at the time. And running scenarios on this, they came up with a pretty stark prediction saying that we cannot continue to consume the limited resources of the earth in the way that we're doing right now. Otherwise, we're going to lead to catastrophic events, even extinction events for humanity. So we say extinction events, and people might say, oh, you know, this is exaggerating. But we have in the past had famines that have led to the death of millions of people. You know, so we've had these really catastrophic events before, and they're ongoing already today in countries like Sudan, etc. And they risk happening in other countries, in China, in India, and also even in Europe. We have felt we haven't been deprived of food, but the price of food has gone through the roof along with the price of energy, and people are really in a difficult situation. They have to make a choice between eating or heating. So in that sense, you know, the way these catastrophes are experienced in different parts of the world is quite different. But despite the problems we've had so far, the general idea is that if we don't act quickly, it's going to get much, much worse in the future. So because of the impact of system dynamic modeling, the idea was, can we use this at a regional level? And so let's get real, guys. The people who did the Club of Rome report, they were the best scientists in the world, supervised by the top researchers, in this area, based at MIT in the US, and they all worked like crazy to produce these predictions in the models. And if you look at the system dynamic model, this is what it looks like. So clearly, this isn't something that you can present to the local mayor and say, oh, look, isn't it obvious? We need to do A, B, and C or implement certain measures. This is not going to be very convincing. If anything, it'll give the guy angina and he'll have to sit down, or she will have to sit down and take early retirement. I mean, I used to teach, well, all kinds of things, but in particular, my background is in mathematics. And I remember teaching, and I had some students who used to get a pain in the chest, from being confronted with solving, mathematical ideas. But anyway, we cannot work with this. We need something else. So part of the early work that we did in the polyrural was to say, well, how can we present this in a way that will be useful to people in local policy, that will allow them to enter into the model and play the game, playing with the parameters and exploring different policy options and comparing different options so that they can decide and say, maybe we should try this one instead of the other one. So what we did was we came up with a simple, what I call a 3-layer model, where these blue boxes somehow represent policy measures. The green boxes describe the regional economy in terms of its assets and its resources. So infrastructure. Here we're looking at a plan for regional tourism. So I had just been doing some real work with real clients on regional tourism. So I had data and various things available at my fingertips. So we picked this as a kind of a case study to help us clarify our ideas. But the general idea is, if we want to make a comparison, we need KPIs as well, So the idea is that these blue boxes are policy measures. They will generally act on the region and its assets, which could be, skilled individuals. It could be the active labor force. There are different ways of measuring the assets. And then the performance indicators that you would like to measure to see, did our policy work, or is our policy working? In the case of tourism, it could be something like, well, how many visitors do we have to the region? How many nights do they spend in the region? How much money will they spend in the region? And how many jobs are created? Now, clearly, this is a simple model, and there are lots of things that you might add to this. You might like to do it in a different way. But we said, let's just start with this and see what we can do with this simple model. And then once we have that, we can make changes to it and improve the model any way people like. So this was our first effort. But the general idea is that if you're working in policy and you want to use the system dynamic model, like this complex thing, whatever it is, if you want to interface, you need an interface that's readable, that you can understand, and so that you can have a discussion on, and you can already start discussing things like, if we do this policy measure, it's going to have an impact on these aspects of infrastructure, and this is going to facilitate, growth based on regional tourism in the following ways. So at least we can set up those conversations. Now, one of the things, when you do a Foresight exercise, it's very common to have a whiteboard and draw boxes and have lines going from one box to another. And usually I like to come in and play a nasty trick with people and say, okay, so what does this box mean? So if you look at the box, B2 accommodation, say, okay, what do you mean by accommodation? So people usually look at you and you say, well, what do you mean? I mean, of course, accommodation is a concept that people will accept very easily. So in that sense, there's no need to explain what you mean by accommodation. Everybody has an intuitive sense of what it means. But if you want to make a model, you need numbers. So you have to be able to say, you know, do we have youth hostels, 5-star hotels? Do we have campsites? You know, do we have Airbnbs? So you need to get into the nitty-gritty of the accommodation at some point. And these parameters are needed to populate the model. So this is one issue. I say, what does the box mean? And it's interesting the discussions that this can generate to help people clarify exactly what they mean. And you'll find that very different people have very different understandings of what such a box might mean. But to build a model, we need clarity. We need a list of parameters at the end of the day. And the other trick number 2 is to ask people, oh, what does this arrow mean? So you might have the arrow linking infrastructure to visitors to the region. And you say, okay, so what does the arrow mean? But in a model, the arrow is shorthand for a whole bunch of equations where the parameters that characterize infrastructure are somehow linked to the parameters that characterize the visitors to the region. And these are mathematical equations in general that economists might have formulated or modelers. So again, this simple diagram hides a lot of complexity. And so the idea is, let's try to start with a diagram like that. And then we ask the nasty question, what do the boxes mean? What do the arrows mean? And then maybe a modeler would be able to come along and translate that into something like this. And we can then put in the numbers from local statistics and have something that we might calibrate and run, and will provide a basis for an interactive model that we can use. So that was why, you know, we have this kind of a matrix. The matrix was a way of kind of formalizing. How do you fill in? What do the boxes mean? What do the arrows mean? And ultimately, everything on the diagonal is a box, and everything on the off diagonal is an arrow. So the general idea was, in the beginning, we could have a design process where we take some aspect of the local economy, such as regional tourism, and we could start off, say, with 3 boxes like this on the upper left-hand corner, where we have one box is the policy measures. These act upon the region in some way that we can define, and these will have an impact in terms of the indicators, which could be GDP per capita, it could be number of visitors, it could be lots of things. And there are lots of choices to be made and brainstorming to be done. But the idea is that you could start off with a blank slate like this and fill it in, you know, using Post-its. So we did a small number of exercises based on this towards the end of the project, not as much as I would like to have done, simply because we were confronted by challenges in using the software, and we kind of had to skip a step. But the general idea is that we could start off with a paper model that we could develop using Post-its with ordinary, you know, a mixed group of people who are not necessarily professional modelers or economists or domain experts, but general stakeholders. And we could do a bit of brainstorming and see, well, how do they understand these things? What do they expect, etc. And then complete the picture with the aid of experts. And so here's just a little bit of methodology. And in one of the reports produced in POLIRURAL, we go into about 10 different domains, and we produce a document which could be used as a starting point for a discussion. So on the bottom, the middle panel is about the regional tourism. So it's essentially what I showed you before. The bottom panel is dealing more with transport. So it's just things to provoke a discussion. And the general idea is that you could start off with a document that looks like this, and over maybe 1 or 2 hours of discussion, you'd end up with a new document that corresponds, that a discussion provoked by by the original one, but you'll end up with a totally different document that everyone is happy with. And then you can go on and you can fill in a matrix like this, and then the modelers will take over and develop a system dynamic model. So that was what we wanted to do, but it's so burdensome and so difficult to develop the IT model, certainly with the tools that were available and that we were using, that it seemed that, you know, maybe we could just stop at a paper model. Already there's a lot to be learned from using a paper model. And maybe there are other approaches that we could use to modeling that might support this. So in the end, when we had a software package called Stella to implement the system dynamic models. And so we started off with our paper model on regional tourism, and we just took a small part of it. Like one of the boxes relating to infrastructure was linked to one of the KPIs, visitors per year. And we said, okay, let's try and fill this in, which meant choosing parameters that represented infrastructure. And that can get very complex. So we just focused on airports. And then in the blue box, we had to choose parameters that represented the visitors per year. And again, that could get very complicated because not all the visitors that come in through an airport are there for tourism. Some are visiting family, some are there for work. There are lots of reasons why people come through an airport. Some are in transit. So again, once you get into these models, you know, even at that level, the link between two boxes, it could become terribly complex. But again, exploring the possibilities of what we could do with these tools, we set up this simple model where on a single page, we have scenarios that we can explore. And then we have a kind of an input scenario and an output scenario. And the input scenario has to do with the development of the airport. So do we add an extra runway? Do we improve baggage handling? You know, do we lengthen a runway so we can accept bigger planes, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the idea of the different scenarios were options for developing the airport. And you could go on. I mean, I based this on work I had been doing in Albania. And at the time, there was only one airport in Albania. And this airport had a monopoly up until a certain date. The Albanian government had agreed not to build another airport. And so the monopoly was broken at a certain date, and now there are many other airports that are going to be developed for the country. But in any case, you know, just on the issue of airports, there's a lot to be done. That could get quite complicated. And the general idea is that here on the bottom right-hand corner, you have the years and the capacity of the airport. So this ultimately is a very simple way of modeling what we do with the infrastructure, is that we increase the capacity of the airport. And so that depends on when the work starts, how it advances in phases, when the work stops. Obviously, there's a cost associated with it. And with each phase, you have an evolution in the number of visitors that can actually come through the airport. So we had equations, you know, to model this. And by choosing a different scenario, you would have different outputs, and you could see the impact over time. Like you have 2005.0. Well, this just reflects the difficulties that we had dealing with the interface. We couldn't even put down the year 2005. It kept coming up as 2000. So these were the struggles that we had. But nevertheless, you know, we learned something from it. And then at some point, we decided, listen, we're not making progress quickly enough to achieve the goals of the project. And the guy who had the software, he went underground for about 6 months and just vanished. Okay, I don't want to be interrupted. I'm going to make a big model, and we'll do whatever the hell we're able to do then with that big model. So that was how things went with us. And as I said, with the Stella software, we had great difficulties in having an interface that was nice, etc. And the Anthony, the guy who was doing developing the software, he went underground and he developed a model with 300 plus parameters in 8 interlinked modules. And so all of that was the complex, you know, arrows and boxes and modeling environment that most people would not like to meet on a dark night. And Runar developed an interface for this, which would be much easier to use. So a lot of work went into that, but we had a great interface that allowed people to experiment with the models. And part of the work we had to do was to adapt each model to each of the 12 regions and find the data from each of the 12 regions to put into the model. So that was a huge effort in each of the regions. I mean, I'm sure Gabriel remembers or has nightmares about the amount of effort that went into finding the data. And of course, we had 300 parameters in the model. We could only find data for some of those parameters. So for the rest of those parameters, we had to make it up. And sometimes we had the data going back 5 years, sometimes 20 years. Sometimes the data was only a time series that was done once every 2 years. Sometimes it was once every month. I mean, huge problems. If anybody who knows anything about modeling knows all about these problems, you know. But in any case, we were kind of rookies in doing this, and we had to learn them as we went along. And we carried out a formal process of designing the experiment. So each region was asked, okay, now that you've done all the work, gathering the data, adapting the model, what do you expect to be able to do using the model? And so we got them to write a little, you know, 3 lines or 10 lines. What do I want to do with the model? How am I going to test the model? You know, am I going to test it on my own with nobody looking over my shoulder just in case it's a disaster? Will I release it to a small group of trusted friends and get, you know, feedback so that we can improve it? And then finally, am I going to test it on a large group of normal stakeholders who probably know very little formally about modeling or economics or anything else, but are just interested in the results? So we went through this whole process, and I pulled together the outputs and made a report, the feedback on these experiments. And this report is available on the POLIRURAL website, and I'll make it available on the POLIRURAL Plus website as well, because it gives us a lot of information as to where normal, ordinary users who are not scientists or engineers or modelers, where they had difficulty and what they expected to be able to get from this kind of a modeling environment. So listen, I mean, Runar, do you want to jump into the model and show people what's available through the POLIRURAL website?
Ironically, even though we have said several times that it is available this morning, the old POLIRURAL website was in fact down, but I have booted up the same things on my own computer now, and I've notified the guys to see if they can put it back up. I think I'll start with this policy options explorer.
Yes.
So with the slight caveat, the slight little exception here that what it produced wasn't true. This is a fairly interesting, from a point of view of my first job, where I was working as a regional planner, and numerous consultancies after. This was something that I felt that I would have liked to have, and I'll show you briefly how it works to those of you who were not involved at that time. So, in principle, it is a simplified view on. It's a simplified view on this complex model that Patrick just showed you, the one with all the circles and arrows that sort of made you dizzy and clutch for your chest and your heart medication. So this was sort of a reduction of that. The model itself is sort of hidden behind here. It has all these 300 parameters that came out of our modeler's hermitage, I should say, when he went underground, as Patrick said. And these are not born out of evil, they are born out of severe limitation, I should say. But nonetheless, all these parameters are there, but for each different region, when you're sitting in a planning situation, you have only so many tools at your disposal. You can prohibit something if the law allows you to make differentiated legislation for your province or your region. You can punish something by taxing it, or you can put your limited investment funds into investing in some sector. You can allow something, you can stimulate something, but your toolbox isn't that comprehensive. And where I came from, it was very much an issue of realizing short-term capital gains. And what I liked about this system dynamics concept was that it does output the likely future, not the true future, but a future trend for what is likely to happen if you push button A, push button C, push button D. So if I invest in education, if I invest in business, if I invest if I lower taxes, I mean, what will be the consequence now, and what will be the consequence in the longer term? So we built sort of a simplified user interface on top of the system dynamics models, which allowed people to have a sort of a column on the left here, where they can describe what they intend to do through some simple measures. So for each participant in POLIRURAL, this was selected which are the areas that we want to work on. So in Central Greece, for example, they said they were interested in saying something about how they would try to impact the vocational training sector. So how many people they will want to go into that. They would want to see what would be the impact of their broadband program, what would be the consequence on the site, and so on, and select a subset of these model parameters. And then the interesting thing is to game the model now and see what would be the consequence. And then it's very, very, very important, of course, that this model doesn't output truth. It doesn't simulate what's actually going to happen, but it indicates with a trumpet of these curves, is it likely to go better, worse, or the same? Is it likely to go flat, slightly upward, slightly downward? And that is sort of the indications we need when we're planning. We're trying to find the best option. The best option might not necessarily be the best absolute option that might exist in the universe, but we're trying to muddle through. So in this case now, they had the downfall of this model was that it assumed that there was a curve of historical development for all of these 300 parameters that was derived from each region. But let's look aside from that now for a moment and just assume that this is based on accepted equations. If we now say that, okay, the baseline for their model, if they do nothing, this is what they assume. 54% of people finishing school continue to vocational training. Now let's adjust that to 60. Then we run the model again. And now suddenly we have diverging curves. It's not a massive difference, not a massive change either. Let's make it 80. So then we start to see what is the impact. And some of these impacts are beautifully naive. Okay, if you put people into training, you will have less untrained workers, and so on. And then depending on the complexity of what you have encoded in your model, you are able then to see how that might affect other sectors. And some of these relationships are a little bit wishful, and some of them are maybe imaginary, some of them are difficult to understand, but some of them are of course real, because you're working from the same pool of people. So if more and more people go into trained professions, there will necessarily be less left over for other ones, and so on. And then you could sort of produce scenarios where you compare several different sets of packages. So you have this year 2 million euros available for investments in a sector. How could this best be put to use? Compare it with different packages. If we increase the broadband coverage of this region of ours from 60 to 80, what would be the likely impact of that? Now here there's suddenly a much greater potential. Once again, allow for wishful thinking in some of the equations that are behind this, But nonetheless, of course, the potential for newcomers, people who do not have present employment opportunities in your region based on primary industries or whatever it might be, they now have the chance of living here, telecommuting, and so on. So you will be able to see the midterm and the short-term possible outcome of your investment. And I thought this is interesting. I mean, this would be interesting, because normally when we made decisions in my province in west of Norway, we had the 4 or 5 year time horizon that follows from political re-election cycles and capitalizing on short-term economic gain. This method, if reduced to a level where we are no longer trying to find historical data sequences for 300 parameters, but try to game this, try to encode simple, accepted equations so that we can run this as a little planning calculator and use it in meetings, use it while we are formulating policy, is something that intrigues me and something that I would like to not ditch entirely as we move forward. I think you have more in the flow, Patrick, or would you like me to move on to this rural attractiveness explorer experiments also at this same time?
Hi, Runar. Actually, I had something to say, and
Yeah,
then we come
do.
back to the rural attractiveness.
Very good. In such case, the defense rests.
Okay. So. So can you see my screen?
We can see your screen.
Okay. So moving on from this, like trying to summarize the lessons learned, you know, one of the big lessons was that we need a well-structured, well-informed design process. And we didn't really have that. We had an ad hoc process. Another thing is that we needed domain experts and domain expertise. And the reason being, most people have a very, very qualitative understanding, if they have any understanding at all, of how the economy should work. And when we were running the models, one of the things that we found is that the regions generally, they did the evaluation themselves, but then they didn't want to show it to anybody. And the reason was because the models just did not replicate common sense, you know. So if you increased investment, you know, in say the ARCIS, the extension and stuff like that, agricultural productivity would go through the floor. You know, I'm sorry, but if you're supposed to do extension work, the agricultural productivity should rise. So there were so many things like that. And also the parameters, they had names that didn't mean anything to anybody. So there was a lot that needed to be done on the design of the model, which required a design process and also a domain expertise. And we didn't have that in the project. So, but we did the best we could with the resources available, and we still learned a lot. So the need for an evaluation process. Again, we had an evaluation process. So we had elements of design and we had elements of evaluation, but none of these were official parts of the project. You know, none of these things were anticipated as tasks within the project. So we had to cajole the partners to set aside time to be involved in things like design and evaluation and all the rest of it. And everybody played the game, to their credit. There weren't too many people who got a bit, cynical about it and says, no, I won't do anything because we don't have enough time set aside in the contract. Everybody really made a big effort and played the game. And as a result, we got, we learned a lot from it. Now, one of the other things, and again, as I say, anybody who knows anything about modeling knows this already, but it wasn't the case for us, is that when you're dealing with data, I mean, the big problem in AI has always been data. There's no secret about that. And so a huge amount, more than 90% of the effort that goes into any kind of AI application is getting data sets and massaging them, etc. And this is very, very laborsome and time consuming, etc. And the other thing is, like, we had all kinds of parameters that didn't correspond, they were just invented, in the model, the top of the head of somebody who just wasn't a domain expert, but they did the best they could. And we ended up then with data which didn't really correspond to something that you could get in Eurostat or in local data sets. So we had to use proxies or invent the data. And this is something that happens in modeling all the time, except that it's usually justified and annotated in some way. So I call this the basic hygiene. So we just didn't have the time or the skill to go in and annotate the models and explain what we were doing with the data sets. So in a sense, all of these models were a black box. If there was something that didn't work in the model, you couldn't go into it and fix it because you just didn't know what was happening. We didn't even have a list of equations, for the links joining the boxes, etc. And there was no time to iterate on those. We had totally underestimated the effort that is required in building a model. So anyway, kind of a word of caution to anybody going into the modeling business is that the data, the parameters, the equations, all of these things require insight and knowledge and domain experts and value judgments to be made by experts to come up with a good model. And even when you have the domain experts, you'll find that they won't always agree on anything, that they will have disagreements because there are ambiguities and there are different schools of thought. So this is something we just have to learn to live with and do the best we can. And another thing that was apparent from the beginning of our work was that essentially nobody understood what you can expect from a model. I mean, in the project, we had these KPIs for the project, and you know how, in the European Commission project management approach, they love KPIs. So we had about 700 KPIs. That's not an exaggeration. Something like 700 KPIs, which included KPIs on how accurate our model would be, without any reference to what we're trying to predict, if we're trying to predict anything, and what the criterion of accuracy would be. So anyway, these are all things that caused us problems, but we were able to manage our way around it. But what it highlighted is the fact that most people naively think models are for making predictions, but it's much more subtle and more complex than that. Ultimately, a model is something that helps you gain an understanding of a complex situation. That's what a model should do. But people have this idea, maybe inspired by fundamental physics or whatever, solid state physics, that you have a model and then suddenly you can predict things to 12 decimal places. That's not the way it happens. You cannot compare real world modeling of socioeconomic systems with a situation where you have a bunch of guys in white coats in a clean room with temperatures, near absolute zero, and with a huge, extraordinary control and very expensive control over the whole environment of the experiment, and calibration activity done on all of the instrumentation, etc. And then you can run a model and expect to get several decimal places of accuracy. But this is not the situation that we're dealing with in real life. And if you have a model for one region, there's no good reason to believe that the same model is going to work as well in a different region. So the understanding of what is a model and what you can do with it is very naive. And there's a need to educate people as to what you can expect from a model. And just around this time, there was a great book that came out by a lady called Erica Thompson, who's a real modeler. She works for the IPCC, I think, and has been involved in developing the global models of the climate and the global environment. And so she wrote a book called Escape from Model Land. So if anybody cares about models or whatever, I strongly recommend that they read this book because she explains very carefully what you can and cannot do with a model. in a very easy, accessible way. There are no equations, so nobody's going to get angina from reading it. But very, very nicely, with very practical examples, she explains what you can and cannot do with models and how you should approach the process of modeling in a way that would be productive and useful. And so one of the things that, for me, one of the lessons is that, maybe system dynamic modeling is not the best modeling approach to use for regional development. There may be other approaches, especially when you see the huge overhead involved in getting the statistics and adapting the model and in calibrating it to whatever is happening, to the laws of economics and the way the world operates and the historical performance of the economy. So a huge effort, and there is no way on this earth that a local administration can can expend this kind of money and effort that would be required to develop and adapt a model for each of, say, the local administrative units of Europe. So what are the alternatives? I mean, the paper models are one alternative. That's something that's low overhead, low cost, and could be easy to do. But for me, the most interesting approach would be something like gamification. And already game-based models, have been popular. The Financial Times has come up with their game-based models. The United Nations, various institutions of the United Nations have them. MIT has produced them. Lots of universities, who are clever, have produced them as well. But the general idea is that the model doesn't correspond to anywhere that is real. It's a fiction, but qualitatively, it has all of the behaviors and the mechanisms that you would expect in the real world. And so you can use that with dummy data, and you can play around with the policy options, and you can see what the policy options, the impact it will have on parameters, performance indicators, and you can play around with that, and you can make comparisons. But the models have been tested so that all of the accepted wisdom and known theories and known phenomenology of socioeconomic dynamics, etc., are reproduced by the model. So we don't have the situation which arose in our model where people would start using it and the results just defied common sense. Anyway, these were among the lessons learned, and I guess it's also a call out to anyone who's interested in the whole area of gamification. I think this is an approach that could be very, very productive, especially in the case of the regions of Europe. You could do one game, and that game, it could be a tourism game, and you develop it with domain experts, but then you can go and you can use this in any region interested in tourism, and you don't have to use regional parameters. Just through playing with the game, you can learn what works and what doesn't work, etc. And these models could be updated over time, by a team that would embed in the model the latest results of good practice and stuff like that. Anyway, moving on, we had another activity within the POLIRURAL project, which was to develop an index of rural attractiveness. So we had a lot of discussion on this. There was, we wrote papers on rural attractiveness, etc. I mean, the question is, attractive to who? To investors, to the people who live there. And when you say to young people, to people in early career, to people who want to retire, but anyway, we did this rural attractiveness thing without any reference to who is supposed to be attracted. And we developed a composite index. And the composite index was something like this. So lots and lots and lots of indicators. So you had a sub-indicator. So the headline index, which is a single number, was broken down into sub-indices. One of them was called natural. Another was called social, another economic, etc., etc. And each of these sub-indexes was broken down into another layer of indexes. So there was like the top and then 2 layers of sub-index. and the numbers for all of those were gathered for all of the regions, and the index was calculated and presented on a map. And the general idea is that you would be able to somehow, you had something very complex represented by a single number. So we were looking at this and we're saying, well, you know, all of these numbers that are going into the index, in principle, these should be parameters of our system dynamic model. So we should be able to connect our system dynamic model to the index. And by exploring parameters, you know, we could use the index as one of the outputs or performance parameters of our policy options explorer. So this was the idea. And of course, it was work that was totally unanticipated. And that we thought of doing at the very end of the project. So we were asking everybody to do lots of extra effort way over and beyond what was planned within the project. And so the first step is to say, okay, what are the things, the parameters of the index that are also in our system dynamic model? So anyway, we didn't find, there wasn't much of an overlap, which is something of an oversight. But again, we were chasing our tails to some extent, dealing with lots of complexity that was really hard to manage. So I think you can forgive whoever is involved for the overlap. But at least we had a little bit of an overlap, and we said, okay, let's play the game anyway, and let's see how we could develop some kind of an interface based on attractiveness, where a policymaker could say, okay, I'm going to conduct policy measures. I want to know what is the impact of the measure on the attractiveness of my region. And maybe another game, so that's one game you could play. Another game you could play is to compare the attractiveness of your region with another region. And then ask yourself, well, this region is more attractive than my region. So what are they doing that we're not doing? And you could have a scenario there where you have two regions with the same index of attractiveness. But then you'd like to drill down into the sub-indices and say, okay, if we have the same overall level of attractiveness, I mean, how are we different? I mean, where are they good or better than us that we could learn from? So you could drill down to another level in the index anyway. So this was the general idea. But a lot of it, the focus of our work was not so much on making predictions or whatever, but was really playing around with an interface that would be useful for a policymaker to explore policy options and get insights, maybe by comparing policy options or by comparing why one region is attractive or more or less attractive than us, and trying to learn something from what they are doing in terms of what works. So this is our philosophy. And as a result, we did lots of experiments in different kinds of interfaces, and we developed something called the Rural Attractiveness Explorer. So, Runar, are you ready to jump in and share with us?
Yes, I am.
About the Rural Attractiveness Explorer.
Okay, very good. I was stupid headbar is taking up the space here. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So the Rural Attractiveness Explorer, you just saw now that it had different sort of sub-indices, all of which are disputable on some level or other. But once again, lifting the view a little bit and assuming that we were able to make some semi-objective judgments about what constitutes attractiveness, I think this thing has some sense to it. Now, the Rural Attractiveness Explorer started off as just a map that showed which portions of Europe scored high, low, medium on a numeric scale. But that is not such a tremendously helpful tool. The more interesting thing is to see what would be the impact of this rural attractiveness if we do option A, B, C in our region, if we implement scenario 1, planning scenario 2, planning scenario 3. So our experiment became a little bit more to see how could we how could we visualize change over time and give people a sensible advice on how the choices made in a province or in a municipality, how those choices would play out over time. Comparing two different regions in Europe, or for that matter, our excellent test areas, pilot areas in Israel, testing it on natural environment and saying that assigning a higher value to forest than desert, it doesn't, I mean, that's not the type of comparison that really makes sense, because for different types of production, different things constitute value. But if you select yourself a subset of things and try and look at how this attractiveness varies within your jurisdiction, let's say, within your area of influence or within your sphere, then it starts to make a little bit of sense. So we tried to make some experiments on that to see how that might be. And so one thing was to see how does this index change over time. And once again, we are resorting to these the output of these system dynamics models to prescribe what is the likely change from the current scenario to a future scenario. Once again, no absolute numbers, and these visualizations are in such case quite okay. So given a certain planning scenario, over time there will be a change. So there's a legend to this. We suffers a little bit from being too tall and showing too many alternatives in the same spot. But red signifies least attractive, 100% signifies most attractive, and 100% doesn't mean fantastic, and 0% doesn't mean terrible. It's an indicator. So it varies with how things develop. So on the Apulia scenario, I'm not going to go into what the scenario is, but it contains a certain configuration of efforts that they wanted to apply in Apulia. So the human-made environment index would go from green to yellow over time, and the natural environment index would go from yellow to red. So not this does not reflect anything specific that they want to do. It was a model example that they made so that we were able to run the tests. So it shows how it would work over time. I'll see if there was any sort of example of positive change here. The Vitseme, they have had at least some effort that had a midterm positive effect before it regressed back into decline on the examples that were. Okay, so then since you saw this rural attractiveness, that was sort of a one made up number for the whole region. But in practical reality, of course, it consists of sub-indices. So if we look at how these develop over time, another approach was to show the total index together with the sub-indices and to animate their progress. So if we start in 2015 and play this model to 2040, we can see how this evolves. A curve pointing downwards means that it's in decline. A curve arrow pointing upwards, something in progress, and so on and so forth. And this allows you to sort of compare how different sub-indices develop over time given alternative A, B, C, D. So provided we could make some sort of a better sense through gamification, as Patrick just said, into the workings of these underlying models, they really don't have to tell us the truth. They just have to tell us, will it go, is it likely to improve? Is it likely to decline? Is it likely to stay the same? That's the sort of, and it doesn't have to be sort of a very fine-grained scale either, but that's the sort of advice we need. The third thing we did was to make a data race. So that is something that you will have seen in many news articles of the past years. So now we put up against each other different development scenarios in a region. We could take Monaghan, since they are still with us in the project. And here were developed 9 or 10 different example scenarios where you do investments that are in enterprise, focused on enterprise, focused on agriculture, focused on infrastructure, focused on broadband, and so on. And now this would be the starting point of our planning process, and we are now interested to see how will this perform over time. Which ones of these will be the best one for Monaghan? Once again, leaving in that the model is inaccurate, it gives us a number that indicates their relative likelihood of success. Okay, so let us play this one, and then we can see how it works over time here. If there was any change at all, that would be rather depressing if it wasn't. Okay, run both above we can have. So then we see as we move along quarter by quarter, the relative change between the different options. And you would be able to sort of infer at what time horizon a certain measure would be likely to have an impact. And once again, transferring this to my region and in west of Norway, where we were very focused on these short time horizons, we would often have skipped looking at what happens after 10 years, after 15 years. Or at least we would pay shamefully little attention to it. I don't think it's right to say about my countrymen that we don't care about more than 4 years. But the idea here is that you would be able to assess the implementation time, the impact time, and which scenario is the most profitable on a longer term. And also here it's possible to measure different sub-indices. You can choose the rural attractiveness under one, or you can take one of many different elements, and you see how would it affect it. So if you're planning for school coverage, you could look at the proportion of school-age population at various times in the future, given scenario A, B, C, and so on. So I think that's as much as it's profitable to say. We are also over time, so I will hand the word back to Patrick for closure.
So thank you, Runar, for that. Of course, we were working with models that were highly imperfect. I mean, the index, and there was a lot that could be said about the index. But the general idea that we wanted to do was to, establish the principle that the interface is important. And again, Runar was explaining the kind of decision-making that he hoped this would support based on his experience working in regional policy. I mean, I have my own experience as well, and I probably would have had, a very different set of things that I would like to do. But anyway, what it underlined was the importance of interfaces and the fact that there is a lot of work that you could do on the interface and making it meaningful for different kind of players. So this was something that we did with very limited time at the end of the project. So again, it was a great testimony to the loyalty and the commitment of everybody in the project that we managed to get anything done at all, because we were definitely working overtime and beyond budget, etc. on doing this. But the principle is the importance of the interface, which is something that sadly tends to be totally underestimated and overlooked, especially by modelers. They love their model and they don't give a damn about the interface. It's not that they don't give a damn, but it's just that it's not on their mind. And in projects like this, not enough resources are set aside. And the skills, we had nobody in the project that I guess you could say was skilled at doing interfaces or eliciting needs from users, etc. These are all skills that are needed if you want to have a high impact output. So again, lessons for the future. So what does this mean overall for the project? So first of all, it means that it's important to have a design process. And we didn't have one in POLIRURAL, and we kind of tacked it on at the end in a way that was imperfect because we were working against, the structure of the project and the contract, etc. That we need to work hard at defining needs. Now, it was very hard to define needs in POLIRURAL because, you ask people, what do you want? It's like Henry Ford said, if you ask people what they want, they said they needed a faster horse. They don't know they need a car. So you need to have some experience of the car before you're in a position to really say, this is what I want. So there's a learning curve on the side of the user to be able to articulate their needs and think in terms of the new kind of tools and capabilities that they want for the future. And certainly there's a need to give attention to usability. So we had pretty low usability, I would say, although we tried hard, to improve it, but we just didn't have enough resources. Usability, especially when we're dealing with people who are not experts. Most of the work that's done in modeling is with usability from an expert's point of view. And so all of the software is stuck on GitHub. If you want to go and use it, you have to be able to hack Unix or something like that, or write a bit of Python code. You need to know a little bit and be a programmer and be pretty resourceful to actually use the code that's out there. But here we have to develop something that can be used by people who are not experts and may not have expertise in-house, to help them get these things up and running. So evaluation is very important. But again, for evaluation, you need to have a clear idea of the needs. And very often what you find out in evaluation is that, well, the needs we thought we had, they're not really the ones that we do have. So the iterative need for a cycle where you not only evaluate what you did, but you have an opportunity to reformulate your needs once you have a better understanding of what it is you're trying to do. And ultimately, in the project, we need to synchronize local government goals, so with the product development goals. So we'll be developing a lot of tools, there'll be a lot of experiments going on, but the main concern is to make sure that these tools are tools that the regions want to use and will help them in their work, in their day-to-day work, to improve their productivity and give them capabilities that they wouldn't have had before. So the iteration thing is really important, and we didn't have time for iterations in POLIRURAL. We basically had one shot, which is a form of madness. I mean, you cannot design something with one shot, unless you're the Soviet Union or the Cultural Revolution. These are examples of one-shot projects where you have one go and it better succeed, and we know how that happened. So one of the things that we should do in POLIRURAL Plus is that we build in cycles of development and synchronize them with the production of the regional action plans. And so shorter policy development cycles. So there is a tendency, when you talk about foresight and participative policy processes, there's a tendency to do something over 1, 2, 3 years. But you don't have to. I mean, I have run foresight activities over 3 days and come up with useful results. You can take 3 years if you want, but it better be a huge problem. I think there's no need at all at regional level to spend 3 years even over a foresight activity. So the idea is that we do things that are maybe less comprehensive, more accurately targeted, and we do several regional action plans based on a cycle that is less than 1 year. So this is a proposal. Obviously, each of the regions involved in the project, they have their own constraints, etc. But the cycles are important because otherwise, if at some phase in the cycle, you want to use tools to improve your productivity and give you capabilities that you mightn't have had before, you would like to be able to come to use the tool, evaluate it, and then come back and use it again. And so what we're asking you is to try to structure your regional action plan work so that it builds in several planning cycles where we can come back, improve the tools, and then you can come back and evaluate the improvement. And you have several opportunities for improving the tools and also understanding how you want to use them, because that's part of it. The point is, you know, if somebody produces software and it doesn't work, you know, you can easily say, well, you know, the software was bad, or the software wasn't good, but that's not actually the case. I mean, how good was the understanding of the needs? And so and this is on the user side as much as on the software developer side. So there is a learning curve on both sides, one as to what kind of product needs to be developed, and a learning curve on the user side as to what are the real tasks where we can gain efficiencies and that can be supported by these tools. So one of the questions we can ask ourselves as we go along is that whatever we're doing, is it going to help, you know, accelerate progress on the existential challenges, achieving net zero at regional level, providing local input to the next CAP reform? Is it going to help implement the new European Bauhaus, etc., or the EU missions? So is it going to accelerate progress on some of those issues which are important for the region? So are we going beyond business as usual? Now, some partners in POLIRURAL, for reasons, you know, best known to themselves, they did not change their processes. They just did what they were going to do anyway, and, you know, interfaced with the project. But the point is that we need to go beyond business as usual. So an ideal output of the use of the project and the use of the money and time of the project is to change your processes, change the way you work locally to be more effective and to be able to do more with less and in shorter time. And what this means is, coming back to the LTVRA, it's a transformation that's required of rural regions. It's not changes, you know, a little bit of a tweak here and a tweak there. We need root and branch transformation so that the rural areas are no longer the kind of embarrassing uncle of regional development, all about farming. And every now and then a whole bunch of tractors come out of the rural areas to cause havoc in the city. The rural region is a fully fledged economy with all its diversity and complexity, and it has to be managed as such. And so, but it means that the job of management is much more than just administering some local funding coming from the Common Agricultural Policy, as has been the case for many regions in the past. So the transformation, in particular, the area for transformation is in governance and in finance. These are the big challenges. And there are many examples where transformation is happening and it's successful. And so you can be inspired by this. So nobody, you know, we do have some place to look, to be inspired and say, okay, that's what transformation looks like over there. We have to decide what it looks like for us in our region, and enabled by the presence of this POLIRURAL Plus project. So just since there's mention of Foresight, etc., you know, a major part of the work, on the one hand, you have all of the development work with experts like Runar and Carol and Sharka, etc. But then you also have the regions. We have 9 regions here that have to develop regional action plans. And there is, you know, the idea of using a Foresight approach. For me, Foresight is just a change management tool. I've been doing it for almost 30 years. And it's just, I would say, a common sense element of any competent management activity. But in particular, it's not about reports. And sadly, a lot of what the Commission, the European Commission, has financed as Foresight over the years comes down to writing a report. And you have a vision and an action plan, you work with stakeholders, etc., and it ends up in frustration because it doesn't end up in measures that are implemented and adequately financed. So when I work on Foresight, for me, a result is in terms of policy programming, design, and implementation. That's the result, not the report. The report is nothing. It just means time spent and effort expended. But unless that translates into programming, design, and implementation, you don't have a result out of your foresight exercise. And the main enablers are, in terms of a result, is there new legislation, new capabilities enabled by legislation? Do you have new sources of finance? And is there continuity of effort of the initiative as governments change and life goes on? So anyway, what I will do is in the coming weeks, I'll send out another doodle for a webinar on the foresight stuff and the methodology and how we could use some of the elements that were already developed in POLIRURAL. And the idea is that we focus more on the methodology of how to work more efficiently, how to use the tools. So work package 3 is on methodology. But we will talk about the foresight methodology, but in particular, we'll be looking at how we can use the tools that are available to allow us to work more efficiently, increase our capabilities, and respond to the shocks that we'll be receiving at the level of local government in the months and years to come. So that's it for me. I don't know, Runar, do you have anything that you would like to add at that stage?
No, I think that's good. I think just to remind people that this is to some extent a recap to see where we're coming from, so that POLIRURAL Plus doesn't just become a name similarity, but that we also try to advance some of the things, some of the concepts that we started working on. I think it's a useful baseline. So I have nothing further to add.
Yeah, but I would add that it's not just a recap of what happened in POLIRURAL. We're trying to set up the principles by which we need to work in POLIRURAL Plus, so that we have a high impact outcome in the end.
Certainly, I was mainly referencing the fact that some of this might be some of these things may be on the not too distant memory horizons of some of our participants, but certainly.
Yes, I wasn't criticizing you, Runar. I just wanted to make sure that the point got across. That
yes.
And in the work that's going on behind the scenes, between the people that are running the major work packages, we're discussing these issues of, how to synchronize our work, etc. So I'm sure many of you have, some of you might have questions that you want to ask, or you want to express shock or dismay or disappointment. I mean, now's a good time to come out with that. Okay, well, listen, in any case, I want to thank everybody who came along and was able to stay to the end. We were a little bit longer than we had planned. But the registration will go online, and I'll send out a doodle for another meeting where we will look more in detail at the kind of methodologies that we could apply on and dealing with our regional action plans in this project. Marietta.
Yes, hi Patrick, Runar, and everybody. Hello, good to see you again. I have just one point I'd like to raise, because with the new strategic plans, CAP strategic plans, all the member states are building this agricultural knowledge and information system, AKIS, maybe you know about it, yes. Yeah. And I think this could be the very suitable area where we could expand our activities and be more useful at the national level. Yeah. We ourselves already started, we connected our national point and started to participate in the working groups of these AKIS. And I think that the outcomes of our project could be more valued by these authorities. I've been in Veneto, in Venice, last week. Yeah, I'm confused with the dates because I've been traveling a lot. Sorry, but recently I've been in Veneto, and they've been building. Because they have a different structure. We have one national AKI system, and they have regional for each Italian region, because Italy is big. And I put them in contact with Apulia, who was in POLIRURAL, and they have developed text mining. So they've been actually looking, these people that are developing AKIS systems in our countries are looking for these AI technologies that can help them. So it's a good place where to go, you know, at the national level to continue. Okay.
Oh, that's a great idea. And especially when we know that these people are looking for tools. So if we do some work on this subject, we have a good chance of producing tools that they might be interested in and find relevant. So thanks for the heads up on that, Marietta, and also for anybody else, you know, if you see areas where we could, you know, maybe orient ourselves to be more relevant and pertinent to a public, you know, out there, this would help us a lot in the dissemination. But anyway, Marietta, I'll integrate that in our next webinar, you know, so that we can discuss it. And maybe if you want to tell us a little bit more about what's going on in this area, that will be useful for us.
Okay. And I have one more, another one, because we are very involved in the Rural Pact community. So we are participating in many activities. As you know, there was in Sigüenza, I was in Spain last year, I think in September, and then there were the conclusions of the Council of Ministers on Rural Pact. So we've been following this, and next month in May, I traveled to Brussels. Actually, they're having a meeting in Brussels, bringing the Rural Pact closer to citizens. So I'll be in Brussels for this event, and I think it's important to highlight, you know, at any occasion, our project would be nice to think of something that we could present there in May in Brussels.
Indeed, I think it's really important for us to be present in meetings on the Rural Pact. I don't know, so maybe are there flyers or leaflets or brochures, or is there some communication we could do in the meeting in May that would raise the profile of POLIRURAL Plus?
Tell you the truth, I haven't read it yet. It's going to be Policy Action Lab.
Okay.
So it's going to analyze in depth inspiring local initiatives and exchange on how the Rural Pact can be brought closer to citizens.
Okay.
That is the main. I can share the link in the chat so that you can have all of you look at it.
Great.
At the event page. They have this selection procedure, so I had to apply some time ago because they always have a limited capacity of 150 people.
Yeah.
They have a selection procedure for the participants. So I don't believe it's still open, but I'll be there. So if you see any opportunity that we can use this forum to present something,
okay,
way, I'll be happy to do that.
Great. Thanks, Marietta. Anybody else with some last minute inputs before we close? So, okay, I think it just remains. Thanks, Runar, for your inputs, and thanks to everybody for showing up. And I'll give you a link to the presentation if you want to share it with colleagues who couldn't be here. And I'll be sending out a doodle for another meeting where we look more in detail at the methodology issues on the rural action plans. So great. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
Good continued day to all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.